Thank you for your support of Regent Audio. Each recording in this series was produced by Regent Audio, which owns the copyright. No portion of these recordings may be reproduced for any reason without prior written consent from Regent Audio. For more resources, please visit www.regentaudio.com.
Thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you all for making your way back up here for this afternoon's session. And thank you for this morning. I'm sure most of you will agree with me that being able to sing together like that is a gift. Malcolm, I usually start with asking speakers to tell us about their family. And I did not start there, which is unusual for me. But we heard some delightful stories last night, those of us in the library, about Felicity. Malcolm has two children, Felicity and David, as well as his wife, Maggie. And maybe I'll just hand this over to you like this. We heard a lot about your courtship the moment turned for the engagement with Maggie. I'd love to hear, and I'm making the grand presumption that therefore others would, I'd love to hear how you met Maggie. But then also if you could tell us a little bit about your children, and for the sake of the team, there's only a couple up here right now. Maybe hold on. We'll see if hold till the end. What Felicity does that I said some of the team would be really excited to hear that she does. Are you tracking me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, right. So, I found this interesting. So how I met Maggie is quite interesting in itself. I had gone up. I'd gone up to Newcastle to the northeast in order to train as a teacher, do a 1-year postgraduate certificate in education, and I came back. I would have taken a job anywhere in the country. I just wanted to teach English in a regular state high school, and get teenagers to love poetry. It was the mission. So, but it so happened that the first job that came up and which I got was in St Ives, which is only about 15 or 16 miles from Cambridge. And I lived in a little village for one term, but then I actually realised, look, it is really easier to live in Cambridge. And I had a battered old motorcycle sidecar combination, which I rode into work each day. And there's something about Cambridge, once you know and love it, it is a kind of gravitational pull that pulls you back. So I got lodgings on a road leading, in one of the suburbs of Cambridge called Hills Road. And as I say, I was a fairly recent Christian. I came back to teach in 82, and I'd only been confirmed myself in 80, so I was still kind of exploring it. And I'd come back to faith on an intellectual level. Partly, C.S. Lewis was the most modern person I'd read, and it was, I was mainly reading Augustine and Bernard and then Lancelot Andrewes, John Donne, George Herbert. So the whole cast of my mind was kind of theology stopped at the 17th century, and I'd been in fairly. The sacraments were really important to me, so I'd generally gone to fairly Anglo-Catholic churches. But I'd had a very strong conviction while I was up in Newcastle that I really. And also through rereading Screwtape Letters, funny enough, that I shouldn't shop around for churches, that I should really go to the local place. I was Anglican, so I'd just go to my local Anglican church. And so I moved into this place on Hills Road, and I went to look at my local Anglican church, and looked quite lively. And there was a big notice board outside, and they put not only the preacher, but the title of the sermon coming up. And I thought, well, let's just see what's happening this thing, and it said title of the sermon was Stoned or Not, and the preacher was, I thought, well, it's got my name on it right there, but the preacher was Reverend Dr. Margaret Hutchison. Well, I had actually, back in the day I had actually never heard a woman preach. I'd never actually been in a church where a woman was preaching, not out of some conservative choice, but just because that's the way it was back then, And so I was intrigued that it was a woman, and I was intrigued by the title of the sermon, Stoned or Not. So I went into this church on the Sunday, and it was Maggie, of course, and she's an amazingly good preacher. So her two texts, which you probably will have already guessed, her two texts were the passage in Exodus where a man is caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath and is taken out of the community and stoned to death, and the passage in John where the woman is taken in adultery and they say the law of Moses says such should be stoned. You know, what do you say? And Jesus says, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. So it was a very powerful sermon, both about the movement from the Old to the New Testament. But the core of it, as I remember it, was Maggie, I mean, it wasn't a distinction original to her, but Maggie made this really helpful distinction between shame and guilt. Shame being the way a community makes an individual feel. And that, in a sense, the most extreme outward and visible sign of being shamed, you go beyond having the finger pointed at you or being ostracized, being pushed out, is for somebody to be pushed out of the circle and literally have people throw stones at them when those are the very people who were in your community who should have been making you feel hospitable. So she said, even though we've never, any of us, been taken outside the camp and stoned to death, we've experienced something like that. We've been made to feel socially ostracized and awkward, and it's a very horrible thing. But it's quite distinct from guilt. Shame is how other people make you feel, and they can say something is wrong and they can shame you. But it may or may not be wrong. And in fact, she pointed out that people can be made to feel ashamed of doing entirely the right thing, and that there are lots of times in our own subcultures and our youth cultures, and times when a culture and a society itself has become corrupt, that they shame people for doing good. Equally, she says, guilt is about what you feel when you know yourself to have committed something that is morally wrong. And even if nobody saw it, and even if you were praised for it, you would still feel guilty. And then she again pointed out that cultures can take something which ought to incur guilt and actually make it a subject of great praise, you know, so that people are praised for being, you know, rapaciously greedy and conspicuous consumerism, which ought to make a person feel uncomfortable, if not actually guilty, becomes the very accolade and the opposite of shame. So she made this distinction between shame and guilt. And she also talked about how broadly you can speak of moving from a shame culture to a guilt culture, and that you could argue that some ancient societies didn't really have the concept of an individual guilt, but only of public shaming. But that as soon as you have a personal God, as soon as you are in an intimate covenant relationship with a God who's staked his life for you, then you know the difference. Mm-hmm. So then she interpreted the story of the woman in these terms, and it was a complete revelation to me. So she said, when this poor woman has been seized upon and is being dragged through the market square and brought to the teacher, Jesus, they are shaming her. Mm. And the poor woman, you know, she's probably in a culture where you need to be covered. You know, if she was caught, as they say, in the very act, may not be fully covered. Everybody's making a spectacle of her. And then, furthermore, of course, these men are exploiting her, and they're not really interested in dealing with the moral issues of the adultery at all. Mm. What they're interested in is catching Jesus out. They want to exploit Jesus' compassion to make him say something which would be against the law, so they can then deal with him. But the woman is a mere object to them, and she's an object whom they're shaming. So Maggie then said, Jesus draws with his finger on the ground. And she said loads of people speculate about what he drew, but she said the most important thing is that he had his eyes down there, that he would not shame this woman. He would not participate in the shaming at all. He wouldn't look at her. And then after he said, let him without sin cast the first stone, and they begin to depart, beginning with the eldest. She made great play of the fact that it was the eldest who went first. And then he says, he's still not looking at her. And then he says, who has condemned you? She looks around. No one, sir. Then he looks up at her. Neither do I condemn you. And then finally, at the end of it, go and sin no more. He deals with the guilt. Yeah. But that Jesus absolutely refuses to even consider the issue of guilt until the entirely irrelevant question of shame has been pushed out of the door. And then the issue of guilt is never ever about public finger pointing. It's about an intimate exchange. And it's about not wanting to sin and wanting to repent precisely because you haven't been condemned. Mm. So this thing about getting the shame out of the way and just doing, as she preached, I thought, God, you know, I began to look back all kinds of episodes in my life where actually shame had driven me to do the wrong thing, you know, or where I'd suppressed guilt because I got honor for my guilty activities. And I was seeking honor and, you know, and it was just a revelation. And I was thinking, blimey, you know, I feel quite exposed by this. You know, this is really speaking into my heart. So anyway, I started going to this church.
Okay.
And she preached quite often and was really good. But noticing that I was a young teacher, she immediately assumed that, you know, since I wrestled with difficult adolescents all week, presumably there's nothing I'd like better than to run the youth group in the church. You know, on a Sunday. But anyway, the sweetener was that I would run it with her.
Okay.
And so we ended up running the youth group together.
Excellent.
And fairly early in the exercise, I got a slight injury and was missed a Sunday. And she rang me up in her deaconess role and said, you know, are you okay? And I said, fine. She said, would you like me to come and visit? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, you know, I could bring some beef and some beer. And I thought, that's my kind of pastoral visit. Yeah. So anyway, we got to know each other. And by the time you run a youth group together, if you're two unmarried Christians running a youth group together, you might as well publish the banns of marriage straight away. Because if you don't, the youth will, you know. Yeah. So we got married, and we got married on a Sunday during a family service.
Oh,
it was great fun. Yeah. So we got married in '84.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. And out of that
children,
union.
Yeah. So we have two children, David and Felicity, who are absolutely kind of chalk and cheese. So we thought we'd wait a little before we have kids, but then we actually discovered that were told that we couldn't have kids, you know, and we were going to, you know, that was quite a disappointment for us, and we thought about that long and hard, and we, you know, all the nudges, all the way the thing was going was to send you down the sort of techno-medical direction and, you know, IVF and all that. But the more we looked at that process and we saw these so-called spare embryos and all of that, the more in the end we thought we're not going to do that. So we looked at adoption, and we adopted eventually. So we adopted our boy David, who's wonderful, kind of very ebullient, very childlike kid. But he has sort of somewhere between middling and stronger learning difficulties. Okay. So he's 26, but he has a reading age of about 6 or 7. Okay. But he's got quite a lot of nous in other respects. And as I say, he's kind of full of sort of enthusiasm and energy. I mean, he's had a lot of knocks in life, but he always gets up. And for a while, we wondered whether he would ever be able to live independently. And we certainly didn't want him living in any kind of institution. And we obviously wanted him. And gradually, in a series of, you know, pretty extraordinary achievements for him, he's got to a point where he could live independently, quasi-independently. He was in sort of sheltered housing. And then he was at a special school, and he met somebody who'd been at the special, a woman who's older than he was, but who'd been at the special school, you know, about 5 years ahead of him. And they got to know each other and fell in love. And a couple of years ago, they got married. Okay. My band played at the wedding, and they live, because David was always roadie to the band, and so they live in March, which is a town about an hour and a half north of where we live. She works in a food packing plant, and David kind of keeps jobs for about 3 or 4 days and then loses them and then gets another one as a sort of general labourer. So they manage, you know, and obviously they need a bit of help from us. But they come pretty regularly around to ours. They need, you know, a bit of help. But they also help us immensely. And we have a thing in England as part of a series of church projects called Messy Church. I don't know if you know about Messy Church. So Maggie does Messy Church really well. And David,
maybe just a short description for those who don't know.
So Messy Church is part of a whole series of what we call fresh expressions of church. So saying, you know, when you have a mums and toddlers group, or you have kids coming in from between the end of school, that doesn't have to be the kids club and now one day you're going to come to church. That is church, and that there can be worship in that, and that, you know, there's loads of ways of doing church, and that you shouldn't think of these as just little pools of potential recruits to your regular Sunday service, that the church is being church then as now. So Messy Church involves lots of themes and fun and games and, you know, making stuff and throwing stuff around, but is really quite carefully worked and has a coherent theme and some biblical teaching and is church. So David and Hannah are really into messy church.
Cool.
And into being like helpers of messy church. So in a sense, they have quite a strong sort of church life through that as helpers of younger children. But actually, it's also something that appeals to them in their own stages of development. So so David that's where David is at. And Felicity. So we were then, having adopted David, we thought, well, let's try and adopt again. And they basically, the adoption ages were looking at us askance. They already looked at us askance for being Christians, but now they were looking at us even more askance for, being older. So we were just about to give up when very happily Felicity came along by course of nature. Having been told this wasn't going to happen, it did happen. Which was great. So Felicity was born to us, and so then we had a family. We had both kids, and Felicity. So she was in every sense a great Felicity to us, and so. She then, it turned out, was almost the opposite extreme. She turned out to be very bright and acquired reading very early and an absolute love of all the stuff we're dealing with. So absorbed Lewis, the whole of the Tolkien legendarium, all the Harry Potter stuff. When she went up to St Andrews to read history, she was involved in all kinds of medieval reenactment societies, and to my great relief, learned to handle a broadsword and a pickaxe. Because as a father, you always, is my daughter going to be all right? And I have much more concern for anybody who's stupid enough to try and mess with her. So, but then the great thing she said to me, you've got So she called me just a few weeks into St Andrews' first term and said, Dad, I made the Quidditch team. And I'm going, what? It's like, anyway, it turns out Quidditch, I thought it was just a bunch of kids only at St Andrews, messing around on a Sunday afternoon, running around with broomsticks between their legs. But in fact, it's a whole sport. And St Andrews plays, the St Andrews Snidgets became the Scottish champions, and then turns out they play in Oxford. The Oxford team is called the Radcliffe Chimeras. And it's so good. And the Durham team is Durham Strang. Anyway,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it is awesome. So it's a really big sport.
It's an international.
It's an international sport. So after she graduated in history, she wants eventually, I think, to work in sort of some sort of development or charity development agency, Christian one. She amazingly, in spite of both her parents being vicars, she's retained her faith and indeed
It's a miracle.
It is a miracle. I mean, so she probably wants to work for something like Christian Aid, but she was just traveling and getting experience. So she went to Hong Kong to teach English in a primary school, as a sort of English assistant. And then got selected for the Hong Kong Quidditch team, who were then going to Tokyo to do like a massive Southeast Asia Quidditch championships. They came second. So she's an international Quidditch star, which is just mind blowing, really. Given both me and Maggie, neither of us were very athletic. But she's also she's a star in lots of other ways, and she's somebody with great compassion. And I have, well, what are we now? Now's today the 3rd or the 2nd?
It is the 4th today.
Oh, hooray! Okay, so today is the day, God willing, that she comes back from a month in Nablus in the West Bank, teaching English and organising sports for Palestinian children and young people. But, that's quite difficult to do, and quite, in terms of the borders with Israel and all the rest of it. So I'm very much kind of have her in my thoughts and prayers until she's safe home again. I mean, she's always doing this, she's always going off and having great adventures, and, she's going around Vietnam and Cambodia, hitching all by herself, whatever. And I'm going, But she's not hitching, but she's pretty sensible. But
also got her sword and her broom. So
she has got a sword. Yeah, she has got a sword and a broom, and she's... so that's Felicity.
There are 2 other members of your household, correct?
Well, there are indeed, yeah. I sometimes think, just as our children have flown the coop, and we might be really independent, and I might be able to persuade Maggie to come over to Canada, suddenly we acquire George and Zara, who are two retired greyhounds, really big dogs. And they're lovely, greyhounds are very gentle dogs, but it used, back in the day, the greyhound racing fraternity, they used to just use these dogs and then abandon them or kill them, because they're only good for racing for about 3 years, and then they get so competitive. So there's a thing called the Greyhound Trust, which essentially rescues greyhounds.
Okay.
And then people who love dogs adopt them. And so we adopted this pair of greyhounds, and they are wonderful. They're very gentle, and in fact, it's not like you have to be a super athletic yourself. As far as the greyhounds are concerned, they've done that. They've been, and they're described. They're described by people as the 40-mile-an-hour couch potatoes, because essentially, they have one quick scamper and then
they're whooped.
then that's it. And of course, when a greyhound stretches itself out, I mean, the capacity of one dog to occupy a 3 or 4-seater sofa fully, and they loll around looking impossibly elegant and very sort of laid back, So when we originally wanted to get one, and then we realised these two dogs had been housed together, and they'd been rehoused, and then the woman who'd taken them had become ill, so they'd ended up back in the kennel, so they were quite insecure because they'd had a home and then had it taken. So we thought, we had to take both of them, and they're very beautiful, tall, elegant, slender, keen-nosed dogs. So I said to Maggie Riley when we got these dogs, I said, well, at least I'm going to be a standing contradiction to this thing that pets and their pet owners really look like each other. I said, either a really miraculous change is about to happen, or he's, So, yeah.
Excellent.
So, the greyhounds have not worked a magical effect yet.
Wending our way westerly here, you like to mess around in boats, so I'm told.
Absolutely, yeah.
Could you tell us just a little bit about you and boats as we wind our way towards Tolkien?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love boats, and partly I think it goes back to being on board ship as a child when we went back and forth from Africa, and my mother's love of boats, but also my father. So my father had at some point learned to sail, and I think on a holiday in Norfolk, and had a great yearning towards boats. Both of my parents loved the poetry of Masefield. So I talked about my mother quoting Masefield's one about the sunset. But my father's great poem, whenever we got anywhere near a coast, would be, as I'm sure some of you know it, I must go down to the sea again, the lonely sea in the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking, So when we came to Canada and arrived in Hamilton, which was a pretty grim industrial city in those days, with pools of polluting smoke rolling over it and the eternal flame of Stelco, But the thing it did have going for it was the harbour and the lake. So we joined the yacht club there, and Dad got a sailing boat. And then when my sister and I were in our early teens, he bought us a little dinghy of our own.
Okay.
So I learnt to sail there. And there's something about being afloat that is really central to me. And if I'm about to burn out or break down, I usually have dreams to do with boats overturning or being grounded or, I once, before I had a kind of collapse from doing too much, I dreamt I was on a beautiful old narrowboat, and the water in the canal was getting shallower and shallower and sludgier and sludgier. And I got out of the boat, I walked along the boat, and I got out of the boat and went into the front of it to try and see if somehow I could miraculously clear something so that there would be water and the boat would float. And then I suddenly became aware that the engine of the boat was still running, and it was running on. And the boat itself, which should carry me, was rearing up and was about to crush me.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't take a lot to interpret that dream. So for being on a boat, almost whenever, one of the things, I was working very hard at Regent, and they pile on ridiculous amount of stuff for you, there's no clear. But I did manage to get away one afternoon onto somebody's boat and just float. And my father was my father was very dutiful, very conscientious guy. When he died, it fell to me to choose his epitaph. And he was a great Latinist, as well as a really strong Christian. And I knew I needed to find something from Virgil for my father's tomb. And what I found was mens sibi conscia recti. So a mind always conscious of the right. I mean, he was the most conscious person I've ever met. But that could be quite difficult sometimes. And the one time he was really unbuttoned and relaxed would be when we were playing on boats. And he loved that passage from Wind in the Willows. So whenever we got into a boat, he would, he would solemnly recite it. He'd lean forward and he'd say, "Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats or on boats, simply messing about." And that became a mantra for us as a kids and a sign that, Dad was relaxed.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay, to set us up for your next lecture, your discovery of Tolkien.
Right, so this again I owe to my father.
Okay.
Having made a tribute to my mother. My father worked very hard and was often in his study at home, and it was a real do not disturb Dad when he was in his study. But there were two exceptions to this. One was when he invited me and my sister in regularly for what he called lectures on the application of intelligence to the solving of problems. I mean, he actually called it that.
Oh my goodness.
And he tried to teach us logic, and he subscribed to the Scientific American and really much enjoyed the mathematical puzzles column in the Scientific American, and he would set those for us, and he taught us, quite a number. They were literally lectures. But the other thing was when he would read Tolkien to us. And so when I was, fairly young, he read The Hobbit. And he read The Hobbit magnificently. And my father, although he spoke with a kind of English, what we call RP, received pronunciation, the accent he'd acquired at Cambridge.
BBC accent.
The BBC accent. In fact, of course, he was from a Yorkshire working class Sheffield background. And he still had the Yorkshire. Whenever he was on the phone to his brothers, it was completely Yorkshire. So I remember, but he did a very good sort of fruity, rather Oxford Gandalf, and he did very nice, Bilbo. But the revelation, and it just thrilled me and my sister, was when we got to the episode of the trolls in The Hobbit. He suddenly went into Yorkshire, and he says, "Nice bit of mutton down from Valley there," but he says, yeah, well, you're greedy, aren't you? But you've had a whole village and a half between you, haven't you? And it was just complete York. It was just glorious. So, and my father's Gandalf was also very good, and he was a good dramatic reader. So even now, when I'm reading, even the so we started with The Hobbit, and he did the whole of that, and then we began the Lord of the Rings, and then it was difficult. I was going off to school, and So in the end, I thought, I haven't got the patience, to wait till my dad's ready to read me the next episode of The Lord of the Rings. So I would have been about 15 or 16 by that time. And, obviously I could read perfectly well for myself, but I so enjoyed it. So, I took the book back with me to England and just read, pretty much sat up all night one weekend, just reading The Lord of the Rings. One of many, many subsequent reads through. And that was transformative. It was particularly helpful to me as a kind of not very happy boy in a boarding school, wishing to go home. I would sort of visit, Lothlorien or Rivendell or other parts and places in that book, just in order not to be in the place where I was, But everything, I began, my smoking a pipe goes back to, Gandalf and Bilbo blowing smoke rings, and the fact that I can blow. So
you can blow. I can blow
smoke rings, and I can blow smoke rings through each other. So for a long time, I was, this was a cool thing. I could do it, and that was what was in the book. And then suddenly, Jackson took it all away from me, because I'd sit at parties, with the smoke there, blowing smoke rings in a way that used to impress everybody, and I'd blow like one smoke ring, and then somebody say, "So can you do the galleon?" And that whole ship in full sail, which of course is not in the book and is a wonderful piece of fancy. But as now, it's up the ante, so it's no longer impressive to blow smoke rings. But I can blow 3 smoke rings through each other. And nearly, but not quite, send them chasing.
So tonight.
Well, if you let me smoke in there.
if you do a triple smoke ring blow, we'll let you pull out the pipe in there.
Yeah.
It's a good trade-off.
Yeah.
Well, let's take that to you and the lectern and
Okay.
Tolkien. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So, look, I'm very conscious as I do this that all I can do is throw out some suggestions, most of which I think you will have already thought of, and I'll probably just be affirming what you know already. But maybe the points I want to make in this paper will, be some starting points for conversation. I've talked about it. I've called it sort of Tolkien prophetic myth maker. I'm really interested in rescuing the Inklings from the nostalgia industry. I mean, not only because I think it's misdirected in lots of ways, but also even among, I meet a lot of Americans who come to Oxford and come to the Eagle and Child, and I go there as well. I love it, but they're all kind of full of this. Oh, if only I'd lived back then. If only I could have been in Oxford in the 30s and 40s, and I would have been there, and it would have been great, and I could have been with these people, and we would have had such great conversations. But I missed the boat. And now I live in the hollow of an unarmorial age, to quote Philip Larkin, and I'm, society is so much less propitious now for this kind of thing, but if only I'd been then. Well, apart from the fact that, if you like Lewis at all, that goes clean against all of Lewis's own advice about, from Screwtape, about, where Screwtape tries to get people to live in the past or the future because neither of them is really real, so that they can't be in the present, and, the past is frozen and no longer flows. The future hasn't happened, but as the present is all lit up with golden rays, the present is the point at which time touches eternity. So, as Lewis says. So, I don't think Lewis or Tolkien would have wanted to be the objects of a sort of nostalgia thing. Also, if we think that it was more propitious, that society was more congenial, that things were more, as it were, set fair in the weather for things like the Inklings to occur back then than now, we would be wrong. The Inklings were consciously and self-consciously contra mundum. They were resisting the trends. They were pushing back against things. They were setting up what was, although they didn't use that term, effectively a counterculture. And it was just as hard, if not harder, to create the time and the space and to be them then as it would be for us now. And I sometimes think we miss out. We should be delighting in the Inklings, and we should be delighting on the way they were encouraged each other as writers and their fellowship. But I think that should encourage us to, the text at the end of all of this should be, go and do thou likewise, not hanker after some might have been. Because they could equally have spent their time saying, if only we'd been living in that golden era in the late 1790s and early 1800s when Romanticism was just beginning. If only we could have taken part in the conversations between Wordsworth and Coleridge. On the contrary, Wordsworth and Coleridge felt like vivid contemporaries to them, and those conversations were happening in their minds and flowing through them in their own day. So it's good to look at the past, but one must be aware of the present moment of the past. So I've generally tried to think about the Inklings as in some respects outliers or forerunners, or people who've dealt with issues in advance that we're only beginning to deal with now, rather than as essentially backward looking. So you asked me about Tolkien and how I came across. I would find it hard to express or even to summon up in my mind just the full extent, I think, of the debt I owe to Tolkien. From that time when my dad read me The Hobbit through to my teenage readings and rereadings of Lord of the Rings. So what have the books done for me? They've informed my imagination and furnished my imagination with these extraordinary images and worlds and vivid characters. And they've given me constant glimpses of joy and hope, stabs of joy and hope when you least expected it. That moment when they're walking through the glades of Ithilien and in the shadow of the mountains of dread, and they see the broken statue and the severed head of the statue of the king, which itself has been graffitied. And I think, so much of my feeling about the great inheritance of culture that, I have in English and literature, I look at modern, deconstruction, and I look at the triviality of our culture, and I feel like I'm walking among the broken statues of giants. Like it's easy for me to feel that. And then they look at the head, and then suddenly the little tangle of thorns around it has flowered. And a shaft of sunlight comes down, and Frodo's hope is renewed by this happenstance, of a broken statue's head being crowned with flowers. But it lifts the spirit, and there are kind of constant moments like that in the work. So it's given me glimpses of joy. I think Tolkien has provided me with a series of kind of paradigms or images with which to think, as well as places to inhabit and from which to grow spiritually. Everything from, as I've already mentioned, Lothlorien and Rivendell, through to the very idea of the Grey Havens and of taking ship and of the far green country and the things clearing at the end. Also, I suppose the story itself, this tale from the great tree of tales, two things. One, I think, was the sense that here was an overarching narrative, a really compelling narrative, which, although it's set in a fantasy world in the sense that, it's a secondary world with the inner consistence of reality, it's a sub-creation, as he calls it. But it's not a world of evasion or compensation or wish fulfillment fantasy of any kind of naive or obvious kind. On the contrary, it's a world which is extraordinarily realistic about weakness and evil, more realistic than many so-called realistic sort of kitchen sink dramas, that I could watch on TV. The capacity for self-deceit, the way even the best of us can, as it were, be gnawed away at from within. I mean, and in the end, the final thing when even, the most heroic person in some respects, Frodo himself can't actually of his own strength do this thing. And the paradox whereby the evil one on whom he has had compassion, the pity of Bilbo, actually becomes, if you were ever to think about what it means to take a phrase like his strength is made perfect in weakness, you'd be hard put to find a better example of it from there. So there was that thing, that here was a heroic narrative in which the heroes themselves are subject to the same pains and stresses and weaknesses that we feel. And therefore we can be invested in them and we have hope. And actually, there's something about the very nature of story itself. You read the story and you read it again and you feel part of it and you want to be part of it. And then when they're at a terrible tight scrape and they this is again towards the end, on the journey to Mordor, when Sam tries to encourage Frodo with, remembering the great heroic tales, and then they suddenly say, half humorously, do you suppose we'll ever be in a story? And, if we were in a story, we'd be okay, wouldn't we? Because there'd be another episode. And the very thought of being in a story encourages them. And of course, as I read the story about these people imagining themselves being in a story, and the lovely thing where Sam says, don't worry, we'll get there. And a bard will step forth and say, nine-fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom, And then, of course, in the book, that actually happens, There's a moment where that literally happens and somebody steps forward and, Frodo's happiness is complete because he realizes the tale has been taken up. Well, that did help me enormously at various points in my stormy youth when I really felt I'd come to the end of something and I didn't know what would happen next. The thought of being in a story, the thought of being a tale that is told and of wanting, that became... became incredibly important to me, and gave me hope. Later, when I came through Coleridge to think of the whole world as God's speech, as utterance, as the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language, I came to realize how important it was to think of oneself as spoken by a storytelling God who speaks you into being. And in fact, I came across a letter which Coleridge wrote to Thomas Clarkson. So Thomas Clarkson, I don't know if you know the great story of William Wilberforce and the campaign for the abolition of slavery, and extraordinarily long struggle that was, and the way they brought this perfectly good, morally clear, rational case again and again to Parliament. And again it was rejected and slavery continued. So Wilberforce was the one who was a member of Parliament, who could therefore do the speeches in Parliament. But Clarkson was actually the guy who'd recruited Wilberforce to the cause, who was the great researcher who went up and down the country and interviewed the slave captains and collected the physical blood-stained manacles, so that they could be brought and deposited on the floor of Parliament, and rode up and down the country and just exhausted himself. And the combination of physical exhaustion and kind of moral exhaustion and just despair. And apart from anything else, both of these men, both because of the way medicine was done in those days and the kind of medication, it was a sort of 19th century equivalent of the opioid crisis. Both men, both Clarkson and Wilberforce, were suffering inwardly and privately from addiction to laudanum. And dealing with this extraordinary irony whereby in the very act of campaigning for the outer bonds and shackles to be released from their fellow men, they were themselves struggling with these inner bonds. And Clarkson got to a point of absolute despair and had effectively, not simply the beginnings of a nervous breakdown, but a crise de foi, really, a real, has my faith. And he wrote to Coleridge, who also, of course, had similar struggles. And Coleridge, what he wrote to Coleridge is he said, I've begun to wonder, I don't understand, I can't pray anymore, and I don't know what it means when it says that the Spirit of God searches our spirit. I don't know what the Spirit of God is, and I don't know what my spirit is. I don't know what these things are anymore. And I feel utterly abandoned. I can't find God in any of this. And Coleridge wrote back a wonderful letter. The last thing in Clarkson's letter was, in short, he said, the divine spirit Almighty, I have no idea of the divine. That was the end of the letter, right? So Coleridge writes back to him and says, don't worry whether you have any idea of the divine. The signal and important fact is that you are yourself a divine idea. And then he goes on to say that, the Lord himself, the Logos, has spoken Thomas Clarkson into being. You are one of the words of the word. And he said, do not make yourself a speech impediment in the mouth of Christ. Don't let him stumble over speaking you. Let him speak you clearly. Let him do the speaking. And it was fantastic. And he kind of restored Clarkson with this sense that he was himself being narrated by Christ. And I love that. He talks about the Logos and the Logoi, and we are the Logoi, and we are all divine ideas which are now being made flesh in our lives. But that we're voluntary. So we can, as it were, we can either let ourselves be spoken clearly, or we can allow, depression and evil, as it were, to slur the speech of Christ. It's a really interesting idea. But it's not calling Clarkson to yet another effort or another action or a work. It's a pure theology of grace. It's about letting God speak you. So I found, long before I ever encountered that in Coleridge, I found in Tolkien, and I think its sources actually are Coleridge in the end, this notion of being narrated, being spoken into being. So a realistic narrative, realistic about weakness and evil, yet it has a place for compassion. And the whole thing, in fact, is full of grace. And unlike some heroic tales, which tend to be, the muscular hero saves the day, which just, if you don't happen to be a muscular heroic type, just leaves you basically as left out and inadequate as you were before you started the book. Whereas there's such an immense variety of characters in the. I mean, obviously there's a lot about evil, but there's an immense variety of different ways of being good in Tolkien. If you think about, the sort of sensitive and beautiful stewardship of Faramir on the one hand, and the kind of robust, sort of portly jollity of Tom Bombadil, on the other. I mean, there's a huge variety. So I don't want to play the game of ranking the Inklings against each other. I believe that God brought all of them, including Williams and Barfield, and together for a purpose that was both complementary and mutually supportive. But if you want to think about the role of being a maker, as the Scots call it, a maker, a poiein, a poet, one who makes, in the same sense that we use the verb poiesis to speak of the divine creation. And if we want to see with Coleridge that our creation is a sub-creation, is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, on the same principles, making a world which is consistent, which is not manipulated from outside, which unfolds organically from within by its own rules. If those are the bases on which one speaks of a person being a poet, that combination in human writing of imagination, inspiration, dedication, craft, internal consistency, and finally a kind of ringing resonance where there's not a false note anywhere in the work. Wherever you touch it, it rings true. Then if you think that's what makes a poet or makes a great creative writer, and that's a gift from God, then I think Tolkien was the most gifted of the Inklings. And I think even Lewis would admit that, actually, great as Lewis is, and, he could just toss these things off. The sheer dedication of Tolkien to this great vocation, and the beautiful and clear obedience with which he completed it. So Lewis, is great. Lewis has an immense reach. But I mean, Tolkien's creativity has been as widely read different ways. In fact, I think it's certainly the case that Tolkien reaches some people whom Lewis would never reach at all. Lewis, I think, just to look at it technically for a minute in terms of how these things work, if you really believe that your creation is a sub-creation which will ring true and have the internal consistency and therefore also the moral integrity and resonance that the actual primary world has, then you will not rush to allegorize. You will not keep standing aside from your own work and explaining it. And there'll be no clunkiness. And just every so often, Lewis, it seems to me, comes close to spoiling his own magic by doing that. I think the rather solemn little speech, which I quote at the end, where Aslan says, well, the real reason why you were brought to Narnia is so that you can get to know me by another name in your own country, is just a little bit too, over-egging it. It's much, much better for the child to discover, amazedly, in their late teens, that Aslan that they always loved might also be an expression of who Christ is. Do you see what I mean? I think just every so often, Lewis just kind of seizes on a point, because he loves it and he can see the point so clearly, so he makes it. But great writing has more than one point to make. So if you make the one point, you're actually spoiling your own work. And of course, Tolkien never does that. So I think Tolkien is in the first rank. I think what I want to look at is, for the rest of what I've got to say, is the prophetic and the countercultural aspect of Tolkien, the way he pushes against the norms of his day and to some degree the norms of ours. So the Inklings shared a way of seeing things, a vision of the universe as drenched and laden with meaning, as logoi from the logos, as intelligible and speaking to the heart, which was the exact opposite of the way the world was going in their day. The way the world was going was reductive, and it was these were units of matter that constituted the world. You break the world down into its atoms and you build it up again. But they were never units of sense. They were never actually saying anything. They were just what they were. So the notion of a logos and a word speaking things into being was fast disappearing from mainstream thinking in the period in the 20th century when these guys were together. But they were all Christians, and they really felt that the world is spoken into being by a word, and that therefore the way of seeing it was skewed if we didn't recognize that in the act of human perception, the world becomes what it is as we see it. That is to say, it's not strictly meaningful to talk about a thing existing as though it existed without any beholder, as though it existed without... And that, I think, just to go back to, lovely to have the reading, you know, when Tolkien sends this to Lewis and says, you know, you call a tree, and you think that's the end of the matter. Yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been whose speech's involuted breath unfurled faint echo and dim picture of the world. But neither record nor a photograph, being divination, judgment, and a laugh, response. So he's actually saying the mechanical impress of a thing, even on a photograph, is not the thing. The thing itself is not the thing until it's caught up into this exchange of meaning between the one who speaks it and the one who hears it, and then speaks it again in the language of the poetic appreciation of what it is. He sees no stars who does not see them first, like living silver made, that sudden bursts of flame like flowers beneath an ancient song. And he compares that it's not a thing that just as a ball proceeding on an orbit mathematical, which of course Lewis shamelessly grabs and uses.
I don't think it's a shameless grab. I think it's a tribute and an acknowledgement back to that poem.
Oh, right. Okay.
Thank you to Tolkien.
Yeah, well, okay.
It's so obvious it has to be a
Yeah,
thank
it is
you.
obviously from there. It is a tip of the hat to Tolkien. But let's consider, you know, how that even happened in terms of Lewis even knowing that Tolkien was starting to work on this stuff. So I think, in a curious way, moments of risk-taking and trust was actually key to how the whole Inklings fellowship built up. And probably no moment required greater personal risk than when Tolkien felt sufficient confidence in C.S. Lewis to show him what he was working on then, which was the verse lay of Beren and Luthien, the poem that he'd begun in the First World War when he was writing in the trenches. And war experience, as we know, is a great source for both The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. So originally, Beren and Luthien, you may remember, was composed in rhyming couplets. And when Lewis took it home and read it, and he wrote back an enthusiastic letter. And if you think like how weird it was for Tolkien to have been doing that, and how easily he could have exposed himself to ridicule, and how Lewis not only got it, but you remember what Lewis did. It's a classic Lewisism. He wrote back as though he had been given a lost medieval manuscript, which and his critical comments, or his maybe you could tighten up this verse here, or I'm not quite sure, was couched in terms of a scholar trying to establish the true text of a lost manuscript. And he then invented other scholars and referred to, you know, Schinkel says this, but, you know, so-and-so says this. And he festoons the whole thing with margin. He not only loves the poem and affirms it, but he immediately enters into a kind of playful world which establishes this bond between the two of them. But then he also writes another letter, more straightforward. Look, I really appreciate this. And he says this in 1929, a long time in 1929. He says to Tolkien, and I think I've put this on a handout. The two things that come out clearly, and this is about Beren and Luthien. This is even before we've even got to what you might want to say about the Lord of the Rings when it finally emerges. The two things that come out clearly are the sense of reality in the background and the mythical value. The essence of myth being, this is, I mean, if only Lewis had taken his own advice. The essence of myth being that it should have no taint of allegory to the maker, yet should suggest incipient allegories to the reader. No taint of allegory to the maker, incipient allegories to the reader. That's what myth is. There's something in the nature of a great myth, a great story, that because it's true to itself and resonant, because it deals with the heights and the depths and the joys and the sorrows and the fundamental issues like mortality and immortality and sacrifice, those elements that are woven together in a new pattern in the story will always be the elements of our lives. And therefore the myth will always be taking upon and touching on the deep things. They will always be bodying forth for us the form of things not unknown, but forgotten or buried in us, and then give us a handle on our own lives. And we will experience that as allegorical. We'll say, oh, that thing out there in that story is like this thing in me. But at no point has the author consciously done that. They've just been true enough to their story that the truth of the story itself does that. So it should suggest incipient allegory to the reader. So in an allegory, properly speaking, as Lewis knew, because he was writing the allegory of love at the time, in an allegory, the writer has a set of truths that could be expressed in straightforward prose as a series of propositions. But he chooses a fictional vehicle for the truths. But the vehicle doesn't modify the truths or speak back to them. And writing the story doesn't reveal anything new about the truths to the writer of the allegory. They already know what they want to say. So the classic example that both Lewis and Tolkien would have known would be the medieval mystery play Everyman, which I once acted in. So Everyman comes on a stage and he's called Everyman. And he meets a character called Strength, who says, I'll be with you forever, hang around with me, and since I'm Strength, I'll be able to get stuff for you. So Everyman meets Strength. And then he meets Beauty, and Beauty turns out to be rather attracted to Strength. And Everyman's going, hey, Beauty, don't you like me and not just my muscles over here? And she's saying, well, why don't you like... And, then they gradually meet other characters. And then he gets old and Strength leaves him and Beauty deserts him and, what am I going to do? So it's a very, very clear allegory. And everybody's actually called stuff like Strength and Beauty. That's not a myth. Myth is something altogether different. We generally think of myth-making as done in past years by ancient peoples whose names we don't know, but then suddenly, right in our midst, a genuine, full-on, pristine myth-maker arrives and delivers to us what is effectively a great mythos, a great story for our own time and world, even though it appears to be set in a very, very ancient time and world. So as a good myth-maker, Tolkien's faithful to the story. He doesn't presuppose what the story is about or how it should be interpreted. He lets the reader's imagination itself tell the story the way it should be told, true to itself in its own world. And in doing that, for reasons that I think go back to the actual creation by God and the beginning of creation and the whole notion of meaning, we end up with a resonant story. Insofar as it's true within itself, it embodies not just one set of truths, but is endlessly generative of truth for every new reader, providing images through which to think and understand the world. And Tolkien would say that the images themselves planted take root, that they grow organically, they branch out like a tree, just as the story does. So Lewis immediately grasped, even with the Lay of Beren and Linlathen, that he was in the presence of great myth, a myth that was generative. And the books that we were eventually given as The Lord of the Rings, which the Inklings heard Thursday by Thursday as the New Hobbit, as it was read to them serially, became just that, generative to them of meaning. And so if you think for a minute, just think about what Lewis's phrase, they should be suggestive of incipient allegories. Some of the incipient allegories which this work suggests are allegories which Well, the classic example would be the whole question of the ring, and we dare not use the enemy's ring. And, if anyone were to take the ring and use it, even though they would appear temporarily to defeat Sauron, they would in fact become a new Sauron. And that this ring of absolute power is in fact absolutely destructive, and to use it is to will your own destruction as well as that. So because the books happened to come out after the Second World War, although the ideas of the legendarium, lots of the initial reviewers assumed that this was a constructed allegory about the rise of nuclear weapons. And they used the terms of the book to discuss the whole question of nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction. And of course, all of this had occurred to Tolkien long before there was any such possibility. But actually, because he was true to the story told him certain fundamental truths about the nature of power, which happened to be manifested in our age by the development of nuclear weapons. So it's more that the nuclear weapons were conforming to a pattern that he'd already seen than that he looked at the nuclear weapons and manufactured a pattern with which... So that's what we mean by suggestive of incipient allegory in general. It's also what we mean by prophetic. And Lewis used to cite this as an example of how bad literary criticism, and particularly reductive literary criticism, which assumes that if a text refers apparently under veil to something that subsequently happens, it must have been deliberate, or they even try and date the text. So he says, as an example, the kind of biblical criticism which is trying to argue for a late date for the original various pericope of the gospel, shamelessly says that when you get in Luke, the little apocalypse, and you get a description of what effectively looks like a pretty vivid first-hand description of the destruction of Jerusalem and the siege of the destruction of the temple, when Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and predicts the siege of Jerusalem. So, the Pelican, New Testament commentaries say, well, the siege of Jerusalem took place in AD 70. Therefore, this gospel cannot be earlier than AD 70. We must assume that these words were written after AD 70. At no point do they say, by the way, I'm also assuming that there's no such thing as prophecy, or I'm even assuming that people were incapable of predicting blindingly obvious political events that were about to happen. There was going to be a collision between the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. They're just so keen to presume the non-transcendent and the secular in the gospel that they take a moment of Christ's prophecy without even arguing about whether it's prophecy or not. They say, this cannot have been written. Then they say, oh, the gospel's really late. It's probably not written till 200. And then they say, well, you can't rely on any of the miraculous events in this because it was written 200 years later. But they've only decided that it was written 200 years later because they'd already decided there were no miraculous events. Do you see the circularity of that argument? So Lewis, when he was tackling that kind of thing, used to say, look, by those lights, the entire arc of the story of The Lord of the Rings could not have been conceived, constructed, written, or even intimated until after the bomb fell on Hiroshima. But I was sat with Tolkien day after day, working through all of this stuff when neither of us had the faintest idea that that was going to happen, So that's a very interesting thing in itself, isn't it? So let's just think a bit more about some of the suggestive or incipient allegories. So in an era of, think about the things we're thinking about now, right? So ecological crisis, clearly. Global warming. Obsessive anxiety about image and appearance. The whole question of aging and the deep, deep resistance to mortality. The attempt to live as though and then to do the technical things for yourself as though. The refusal to mention death or dying anywhere in our culture, even to use the word. What Philip Larkin, the poet, called the costly aversion of the eyes from death. Now, all of these things are great themes in The Lord of the Rings, particularly mortality. And now you can read, you can talk about real decisions, medical decisions to be taken. And you can look back at episodes in The Lord of the Rings and find they give you complete clarity to think. So Tolkien believed, along with St. Augustine, Tolkien, as you know, was a devout Catholic and had a really good Catholic training, so his theology is always excellent. It's always in his roots, it's never in the shoots, he never shows you any of it, but he speaks it and enacts it brilliantly. So he's with Augustine in that evil is not a primal thing in itself. Evil is a bending awry of the straight. It's a wound in the substance of goodness, but the goodness has to be there first. And often, in order to show you this, this is there in the big arc of the legendarium, obviously, because Morgoth, is originally Melkor, and that God, Eru proposes the great music, and it's perfectly possible for it to be and continue to be great. But Eru creates creative beings and actually asks the angels, as it were, to sing. He proposes a theme, but gives his creatures complete creativity to make the music, from which music the world itself will eventually be made. And then you get this figure who is, if you like, the Lucifer figure. This is an exact transference from the Christian mythos, that the devil is originally an angel of light. Lucifer, Lucy's light, fair is Pharos I carry, light bearer, light carrier, who then darkens himself. And every evil in Tolkien's secondary world and in ours is, in the end, the bending awry or spoiling of an original good. And redemption is always about, but therefore there is, for every good, there's a possible shadow, there's a possible way in which that good thing could be done badly. And equally, for every corruption of a good thing, like leadership, for example, there is always in the Tolkien world an example of its original goodness somewhere. And Tolkien pairs them up extraordinarily well. So if you think about the number of times in The Lord of the Rings, he presents you, the fact that he calls the thing Two Towers for a start, the number of times he presents you with beautifully realized contrasting pairs, often actual brothers or kinships in other ways, to look at whom is mutually illuminating. They each illumine the other. So if you think about the pairs in The Lord of the Rings, we see it most obviously in the Frodo-Gollum pairing. And actually, the more Frodo, as it were, increases in self-awareness and knowledge, and if you like to use a technical theological word, in sanctification through the purgation of suffering, the more deeply he becomes aware of his kinship with Gollum. And the more, far from saying, oh, no, I'm a really holy hobbit and you're a horrible Gollum. On the contrary, he feels the closeness to Gollum even more. And in Gollum, we see certain hobbit-like characteristics really gone bad. But still, he's still a hobbit, and it's still capable, therefore, of the riddling and the games. And there's almost a moment of redemption offered to Gollum by Bilbo, when Bilbo remembers the riddle about the daisy and the grass and the sun shining, and for all his years in the darkness, Gollum can almost just begin to remember it, and then he turns aside from it. So that's the a kind of a central pairing. But if you think, in a way, Aragorn and Sauron are the two claimants, if you like, to the lordship of Middle-earth, and Sauron is a kind of all-seeing eye in a tower, who has other people who go out and speak as his mouthpiece. And Aragorn is a king in rags who walks with and who doesn't assume his kingship at all until it's given to him, and who has first been, as it were, a king in disguise, who's physically walked the length and breadth of his kingdom. And his whole method of leading is different. So there are two different ways of ruling Middle-earth. And we see it extraordinary if you think about the Gandalf-Saruman pairing. They're wizards, they're concerned with knowledge and wisdom, but they take a fundamental difference, both in the way of knowing and in what you do with the knowledge. Whether you use the knowledge to dominate or whether you use the knowledge to allow each creature to become more completely the creature it should be, which is what Gandalf does with all the people whom he meets. And in fact, this question, I think, if I want to think about the Istari, the Wizards of the Wise in that world, if I want some prophetic guidance about what to do with our own knowledge and wisdom, the full pattern of it, not only, our literary knowledge and wisdom, but our scientific knowledge and wisdom, and our knowledge and wisdom in social sciences and in psychology, then I can do a lot worse than just looking again and again at, if you like, the Gandalfian and the Sarumanian ways of seeing things, or even of understanding what knowledge is. So you may remember the conversation in the Fellowship of the Ring when Gandalf has been taken captive, was just about to be taken. The trap is about to snap shut on him, and they're having a conversation about ways of knowing. And then at the moment when Saruman reveals his hand to Gandalf is when he says, "White," he sneered, "it serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed. The white page can be overwritten. The white light can be broken." And Gandalf replies, "He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom." So that strikes me as being one of the wisest and most prophetic things written in the 20th century. You could say that the entire effort of the Enlightenment and the Western scientific enterprise was to break everything down, to analyze the brain, to split the atom, and then to believe that reality comprises the broken bits that we've got left after we've broken everything down, after we've atomized things. But in the process, we have in fact undone the beautiful, the magical, the imaginative. We'd ignored the growing synthesis which made the organic whole, which made the whole thing real in the first place. Wordsworth, of course, had described the same thing earlier when he said, "We murder to dissect." Keats, again, using the same image, after looking at Newton's optics, spoke of Newton's optics as unweaving the rainbow. It's not that we shouldn't make analytic distinctions. Of course, we need to do that. But if we have only parts and no whole, then we've left the path of wisdom. Breaking things to find out what they're made of presumes, of course, that we have the right to break them as though they were ours. And then we'll put them back together again if we want to, but put them back the way we want to, control them. We analyze genes, but soon we're gene editing. It's our essentially mechanistic attitude towards reality, that we have a bunch of constituent parts which we reassemble. But then we do the same to ourselves. We discover that we're a bunch of constituent parts, and there's nothing to stop us from reassembling. As Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, this so-called man's conquest over nature will actually end up as really being some men's conquest over other men with nature as their instrument, the person who's doing the controlling. So that outlook does actually ultimately lead to treating people as machines. And I love that bit. I think it's in the book as well as the film, isn't it? Where Treebeard says of Saruman, he has a mind of metal and wheels. He has a mind of metal and wheels. Now that's remarkable because, of course, we now say that gladly of ourselves. One of the problems that we have is that wherever we make something as human beings, when we're capable of constructing a thing, we tend to bow down and worship it, and we tend to remake ourselves in its image. So the classic diatribe against idols in the Old Testament is to say, eyes they have that see not, ears they have that hear not, hands they have that handle not. And then what does the psalm go on to say? They that make them shall be like unto them. The fundamental problem is that we construct a lesser thing, and then we shrink our own spiritual possibilities to fit the lesser thing that we've constructed, and we make that the image. So the absolute example of that at the moment is the whole question of computers. You know, we've managed to make computers which are capable of imitating, because we've put it into them to be able to do it, certain human processes like calculating and playing chess, and they can make linguistic responses and they can speak back to us, and we can have what we're calling artificial intelligence, in that we can have a very complex set of responses. But in the end, it's a series of noughts and ones. In the end, the machine, however much it mimics consciousness, doesn't actually contain consciousness. It is not conscious in that sense. It's not capable of self-reflection and moral reflection, though it's capable of imitating the product of that in a pure show of, you know, I mean, just a deceit. I mean, and those who know it, program it, know that it's a deceit. So, but what do? We now speak of our own memory banks. We talk about downloading stuff. And then most distressing and sinister of all, we speak of programming and reprogramming, don't we? And we actually talk about hardwiring or rewiring our brains, or doing a cognitive thing that will rewire our neural pathways. And there's no reference to soul, there's no reference to meaning, there's no reference to choice, there's no reference to significance, and most significantly, there's no reference whatsoever to story, to our part as characters developing and interacting in a joyous story. We're just going to deal with a behavioral issue by rewiring and reprogramming. And we're doing that particularly to kids in schools, who are kind of the captive patients of what we're doing, and to prisoners in prisons. You know, this language of reprogramming, programming or reprogramming, is, I think, dreadfully sinister. Because a human soul is not a program, it is not to be reprogrammed. And the comparison between hardware and software, to think that my body and my brain is the hardware, and, you know, all my loves and hopes and fears and delights and intimacies, what is that? It's just so much software that somebody else can reprogram when they need to. And that reductive thing, and that belief that you can just wipe clean and then reuse. I mean, this is what is going on right now in China, in a highly technocratic society, to the Muslim people in that region of China, where they're just taking everybody's kids away from them and putting them into these kind of reprogramming schools, and everybody has to have a kind of electronic there's something extraordinarily sinister going on. So Treebeard's saying he has a mind of metal and wheels, and Saruman's own belief that you can break everything down and then reconstruct it the way you want it is extraordinarily prophetic. Now, of course, it's a tree, a living tree who has become a living being, who critiques the mechanistic thing that Saruman is. And then we see that written out further when the trees come, as it were, to release a just comeuppance on Isengard. Now, C.S. Lewis's favourite psalm was Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork. Night unto night uttereth speech. Tolkien's favourite psalm was Psalm 1, Beatus Vir. Blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, or sat in the seat of the scornful. He shall be like a tree planted by the waters, who bringeth forth his fruit in due season. If you ever want an example of somebody sitting in the seat of scornful, it's Saruman. When Saruman sits in his own throne at Isengard and speaks with utter scorn for the hobbits and utter scorn for all these weaklings of Middle-earth, and, tries to call Gandalf into pride with him, that they are the great Istari, the wizards whose time has come, to dominate Middle-earth through the power of analytic knowledge. And Gandalf utterly rejects it. And there you have the contrast between the seat of the scornful and the man who is like a tree planted by the waters. And of course, as you know, the tree becomes is in the totality of the legendarium, the tree is probably the single most important and connective and integrative emblem. The two great trees at the beginning, that are attacked by the spider and the darkness that comes out of them, and the tree, which is, you know, you guys have all got the tree on your back, you know, thank you, yeah, you know, the tree of Gondor, and but the whole thing starts, you know, with the party tree. And, you know, the fact that when they come back and there's the Shire that the party tree has been cut down, you know, that's an attack at the sort of heart of things. So he's got this tremendous sense right from the get-go that trees are the key, and that offence against trees is disastrous. And of course, Isengard is literally flooded as a result of offence against trees. Well, we now know, in ways that Tolkien didn't know at the time, how absolutely central trees are to the whole of life on Earth. And that if we assault and destroy trees, we are all going to, you know, our race is going to come to an end. The time of men will be over because the waters will cover us. Because, you know, the global temperatures will rise, the atmosphere will be changed. And if these trees aren't breathing on our behalf, and if we don't leave them deep, we have had it. We really have had it. And, you know, we've known this for quite a while. And it's not like, you know, I remember when I was a kid in Canada in the 70s reading about global warming and greenhouse gases and the hole in the ozone layer. It's not like we haven't known for a long time. But we have a mind of metal and wheels, you know, and we don't think long, and we don't, you know, respect trees. Meantime, we're now discovering that almost all the things Tolkien thought about trees, both about the feel of the old forest and the forest knowing that they were in there, and then the way the Ents are. I don't know if you've come across, I mean, this was actually work done by a Canadian in BC, I think, who noticed that what happens to some trees affects other trees, even though they're not, you know, like they're different species of trees. And that when they were clearing away some young growth of other trees, thinking that the trees near them would flourish because they wouldn't have the rival. And the trees started sickening. And then she gradually realizes that in sort of the extraordinary networks of fungi running underneath the roots of trees. The roots of trees are only able to get the nourishment from the soil because of the intermediary action of these fungi, and that the fungi spread out in great threads to other trees and actually have this symbiotic relationship with both trees in which they pass nutrients. But actually, when one set of trees is failing or is attacked, the other stronger trees can send nutrients along this, and they can also signal to each other. I mean, this is, you know, I'm not trying to pretend that they talk in human language. These are at a level of biochemical and enzyme exchange, but they are all connected. And somebody some time ago coined the phrase for this as the wood wide web, which is wonderful. I mean, and there is this. So all these trees are much more interconnected and much more subtle. And you know, we just begin to realize that perhaps there's a great deal more in a really profound mythopoeic story waiting for us to be told about and to discover than we'd at first realized. So, trees, key. So if you look at the difference in worldview and fundamental way of construing the world between Saruman and Gandalf, think about how Gandalf relates to hobbits. So Gandalf actually loves the hobbits. I mean, he's not kind of experimenting on hobbits. He's not regarding hobbits as Saruman would be, as either kind of detritus to be cleared away or something interesting to sort of have manipulative knowledge about. Gandalf actually loves the hobbits. So I think I've given us a quote here. Gandalf says of the hobbits, hobbits really are amazing creatures, as I've said before. You can learn all there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet after 100 years, they can still surprise you at a pinch. Now, that's really interesting. What Gandalf is actually doing there is displaying humility towards those whom he has been sent to serve, recognizing that wise as he is, and apparently simple and rustic as the hobbits are, and, you know, immense is the reach of the mind of Gandalf, and, you know, hobbits are just thinking about second breakfast, you know. So you would think there's not, you know, and the hobbits themselves say we can't live long on the heights, you know. But there it is. Gandalf says, no, I can see way more, you know. You think you know everything, but you don't, which is always a good thing for any scientist or wizard or leader of knowledge. He displays humility. He delights in them. He delights them in the midst of also a perfectly proper exasperation with them, but he delights in them. So when the hobbits spoke to him, when he's in dialogue with hobbits, Gandalf has this extraordinary gift for discerning something deeper in what the hobbits say. And he'll even take a hobbit's throwaway phrase and give it back to the hobbit with a kind of profundity that the hobbit himself didn't realize. So this is the classic conversation between Gandalf and Frodo about Gollum, really right at the beginning. So we remember when Frodo says, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance." And what does Gandalf finds the one good word in that unfortunate saying, which wasn't even intended by Frodo that way, and picks it up and uses it for the good. What a pity that Bilbo didn't slay that vile creature while he had the chance. Gandalf replied, "Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end. And when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least." Now, neither Gandalf nor Frodo fully know how true that will be. Possibly when he wrote it, Tolkien didn't know how true that would be. But obviously at the very end, if Gollum had not survived, and first of all, it's Gollum in a sense who helps them and gets them as far as they go, but even when he disappears and goes completely rogue, at the end of the day, if Gollum had not survived, Frodo would have put the ring on and stayed at the crack of doom and not had it taken off him, and would have been seen, he would have had a brief moment of usurped glory and then would have been utterly consumed by the eye and by Sauron, and Sauron would have, and that was all to do with a moment way back in The Hobbit when an invisible Bilbo could have killed a visible Gollum, but wouldn't do it. He wouldn't take that advantage, with no idea of the far reach, of this. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. In fact, the pity of Bilbo rules the entire fate of Middle-earth, this tiny, insignificant hobbit. So Gandalf's approach also is long-term. Gandalf is very much about seed sowing and gathering fruit, rather than crunching and getting what you want straight away. By contrast, Saruman sits in the seat of scornful. So those are just some themes. But Tolkien himself, when asked about what he thought were sort of ruling themes in the legendarium, said on more than one occasion that death and mortality, and the whole question of what we do with our mortality and how we understand our mortality and how we have a proper and humble response to our mortality, that those are absolutely central. Coming to terms with death. So one of his most brilliant ideas in the legendarium is the idea of the alliance of the elves and men. So the alliance of elves who are immortal unless they choose more mortality can be on the same side as and work with mortal men. Now the ring represents a challenge to that natural order of elves immortal, men mortal. And of course, men's mortality is referred to by the elves and originally by the men as the gift of Iluvatar. That it's the fate of men, but mortality is seen as a gift. And it's a gift of which the elves themselves are sometimes jealous. What it will be, not to keep enduring in this world, but to be taken away from it to the halls of Mandos, to be taken, that death, rightly understood, is a gift. And the entire point of all that Sauron is trying to do is to destroy that wisdom and corrupt that idea and have death seen as something utterly and always to be avoided. So the ring challenges that because, a mortal man who puts it on will not apparently die. But in fact, he does die. He becomes a wraith. But he endures. So there's a key moment where Gandalf talks about the supposed longevity given to the wearer by the ring, and the reason why mortal men desired it. And he says to Frodo, "A mortal Frodo who keeps one of the great rings does not die, But he does, this is just so wise. He does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is weariness. Yeah? And of course, Bilbo himself, when he's reflecting on what the ring had done for him, puts it in a rather more homely, why I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread, which at the time of writing was what everybody in England was doing, because we were still in rationing and you were trying to scrape this little bit. Or as somebody once did, I think somebody did a nice little internet meme with a clip of Bilbo saying that, like butter's been, except he's saying, I feel like a children's book that's been scraped over 3 long movies, you know, and spread thin, you know. Now, I know that feeling, what it is. I mean, you know, that when one's stretching, overstretching oneself, one's scraping thin, but we probably also know it in a deeper sense. So we can all make a false choice. We can mistake the endless iteration of minutes for the fullness of life. And there's the challenge. But if you think about the way our culture is living now, if you think about cosmetic surgery, if you think about these kind of endless extensions of life, the idea that we might, you know, we might use medical intervention, as it were, to keep a person going and keep a person going and keep a person going, at a point where there is effectively where we are keeping at bay by a huge and expensive series of interventions of biological death. But we are not in any way bestowing life. We're not in any way enhancing it. And we're possibly putting off for that person, perhaps without their consent, that moment of finality and focus and clarity, which is the end. Now, just if I can lift my eyes from this page for a minute and tell you something, I take really seriously in every aspect the idea that we are, each of us, as it were, a poem, a work uttered by God and spoken into being. And the chief thing about poetry for me is knowing form. One of the reasons why I like writing sonnets is that I can see the last line. And often what I think is the first line of a poem, because it's the first line that came to me, turns out to be the last line, and I can write my way towards it. And I feel that more and more about the poem of my life, that I've got a sense of the form. But this was taught me in a very, very vivid and particular way by the death of a friend of mine who loved poetry. He's a guy called Andrew Dixon. And he and I, whenever we met, and I went up to Edinburgh to see him, just read poetry. We played chess, read poetry, and drank whiskey. It was a great combination. Anyway, tragically, he was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and literally between... You know, he was diagnosed in September, out of the blue, and he died in December. And he asked me to bring him, when he was going through the last of the radiotherapy that was not to bring him his last rites and celebrate communion with him. And I remember, because I was thinking, what poetry, you know, and I brought a volume of Seamus Heaney with me, which had this great poem, how well I know that fountain, filling, running, although it is the night. That eternal fountain hidden away, I know its haven and its secrecy. And I was going to read this poem with him. And he wasn't in his hospital room when I got there, because he was had this last, as it turned out, absolutely last, bit of the radiotherapy, and he was being wheeled back in. And he produced from under his blankets the exact same volume of Heaney that I had wanted, which he'd already found I was reading. So we obviously talked about life and death together. It was got ready to celebrate the sacrament. And he said an amazing thing to me. I mean, I've never forgotten it. He said, almost with a twinkle in his eye, you know, because he knew he was dying, and that's why he wanted me to bring in the sacraments. He said, you know, I always thought I was going to be an epic. Turns out I'm a sonnet. Which was just not only witty and beautiful, but sheer genius. Turns out I'm a sonnet. You know, and he was giving me the immense privilege of helping him to shape and write the final couplet. And we loved sonnets. You know, we talked to each other about what... So, actually, the first sonnet that I wrote that became the beginning of the whole sequence of 70 sonnets that became Sounding the Seasons, I wrote on the day of his funeral. After the funeral, coming back from Edinburgh, I wrote it on the train, and it's called O Sapientia, and it was about I cannot speak unless I have been spoken, nor can I teach except as I am taught. Or break the bread except as I am broken. And I looked at my diary, the back in the day I didn't have phones, my Cambridge diary, and it just on the top of the day, because it happened to be the 16th of December, it said O Sapientia. Anyway, so I wrote a sequence of Advent sonnets which I dedicated to him, and one of these sonnets, the final line is for you will see the day spring at your waking. Beyond your long last line, the dawn is breaking. But there has to be a kind of last line. And that discovery that finality gives form, and form gives concentration and meaning, and makes the whole thing, and it's just not long one splurge gradually petering out with more and more fading ink. It's kind of got form. I feel sort of thin and stretched out. So the endless continuation. And if you think about what happens to Theoden, the king of Rohan, he recovers from a kind of protracted drug-ridden senility which Wormtongue has organised for him, so that Wormtongue can in fact exploit him and exploit his kingdom. Now you could argue, if there was some public inquiry, down at City Hall after the event, you could argue that Gandalf's intervention shortened Theoden's life. I mean, when Gandalf gets him out of his wheelchair and takes him for a walk saying, come and live, he's interfering with his medical care, isn't he? He's inviting him to something, that somebody else has said, oh no, I can keep him going for much longer than that. Theoden, of course, suddenly remembers who he is and is ready to die and knows what he's doing. I go to my fathers, he says, even in that mighty company, I will not be ashamed. And he fulfills his life. He rediscovers who he was, who he is. Technically, he probably has a shorter life than the life he would have had, since it suited Wormtongue to spin his life out. So there's some really profound issues being explored here. Now, let's also make this clear. Tolkien is a really devout and fully instructed and obedient Roman Catholic. So this is not about euthanasia. This is not about taking somebody's life when it's not time and they're not ready to go. And that issue, the evil version of what Gandalf is actually explored in Denethor. And Denethor's decision to end his own life in pride in his own way. But either way, whichever way you look at it, when you think now about the genuine issues about, do I want to have a thing that says DNR, do not resuscitate? Probably I do at a certain point. And that's not willing my death, and it's not, asking for euthanasia. It's just saying, I embrace my mortality. I'm a sonnet. I expect to have I expect to conclude with a particularly magnificent couplet, which makes sense of the previous 12 lines, But I don't want to just dribble on forever, because I haven't got a good editor. I want clarity. But on the other hand, it's not for me. I don't know. It's not for me after 6 lines. If you think about going back to my art, the form I know best, the Volta. So in a sonnet, even when the sonnet goes 4-4-4-2, like the Shakespearean one, generally speaking, there's a turn, which the Italians call a volta, between the octet and the sestet, right? So a little over halfway through, after 8 lines of your 14 lines, there's usually a break, and sometimes you actually see it as a physical gap on the page. And then something turns around, something is different, something replies. And quite often, you get a situation where the first 8 lines are absolutely dreadful. I don't mean they're dreadful poetry. I mean they're about a dreadful situation. They're things getting worse and worse. And you sometimes think with some modern poets, they would have ended the poem there. You would have 8 lines of unmitigated misery and then blank paper till the end of the thing, and that's your lot, mate. But the gap, the sense of, oh, I don't know where to go from here. There's a few lines of nothing, and then there's this magnificent sestet. You get this in Jared Manley Hopkins all the time, that picks it up and does something with it. And so I don't want to be a person who comes to the end of his, grim octet and doesn't wait for the Volta, doesn't wait for the return. And of course, in the case of Shakespeare, sometimes plays this with you. Shakespeare knows that everybody knows this. So Shakespeare quite often does sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, conclusion in the couplet. Or he'll give you, and he often has a dramatic turn in the sonnets. And there's one where he teases you. I think it's the one that begins, when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, troubling deaf heaven with my bootless cries. And it goes on, I'm thinking about all the bad things. So like 4 lines, this is terrible. And you're thinking, it's all right, we've got plenty of sonnet left, He's going to turn this around in a minute. Another 4 lines, this is absolutely awful and pointless. And you're going, wait a minute, okay, that's 8, fine. Now you're going to turn around and tell us why it's actually really so good. And then you get another 4 lines of life is really not worth living. And you think, come on, guys, this is a love sonnet. What's going to happen? You've only got 2 lines left. And it's like he's painted himself. It's like, watch me get out of this without moving. And he goes all the way down. It gets worse and worse and worse. And then the last 2 lines, it goes, but if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. And it ends with the word end. And he only turns it around like in the last 2 lines. So he kind of needs that. So we've got a lot of issues to think about. We've got to think about what kind of extended care we want. We've got to resist the movement in our culture towards euthanasia, just as we have to resist the movement in our culture towards eugenics, which is coming back again. The very things that the Nazis tried to do. They're not calling it Nazism anymore, but it is the same thing. It's about creating these perfect little people. And the movement towards euthanasia is particularly sinister because of the immense costs that our particular form of capitalism has imposed on care for the elderly. And conscientious elderly people don't want to feel that they're depriving their children of their inheritance. They're having to sell the house for care. How much easier to just slip into the next world and, they'll put pressure on themselves, let alone do you know what I mean? There's kind of, I don't. So a genuine issue raised here about I don't want endless extension with no extra life is countered by an equally dreadful thing that I need to wait until God says I'm ready. And I know I'm ready. And there has to be that moment of completion. And I'm not going to be like Denethor and fling myself onto a pyre before the outcome of the battle has even been decided. But where is that? I find it quite difficult to see where that's... And yet, happily, the generations that are really going to have to think about this, our kids and grandkids' generations, thanks to the film as well as the thing, are being given a magnificent series of images and stories with which to think about those issues, if they can only see that that's what they're for. So that, in that sense, I think the work is just genuinely prophetic. But we're coming towards the end of our time, so I want some response. Let me just finish, really, with the, I think the profoundest piece of meaning or incipient allegory, if you like, whatever Lewis wants to call it, in the whole thing. If you think about the range of Tolkien's reading and his sheer knowledge, because of languages, of the entire wealth of the mythological deposit of the whole of Western Europe. I mean, everything, all the classical stuff is there. He's got the Norse stuff, he's got the Welsh stuff, he's got the Icelandic and the Finnish stuff. He has access to every story. And he weaves bits of all of them into his own thing very beautifully. Because as he says with characteristic humility, his is only a branch and some leaves on the tree of tales. And they spring naturally, the great tales, and in the end we're in the final great tale, which is, the Evangelium. But so he's writing a great quest story, right? So he knows all the other great quest stories. And I think pretty much without exception, all the other quest stories that we have are quests of acquisition. They're quests to find a treasure. That's what it is. The treasure, all of them. The treasure is guarded by a dragon, for the Volsung. The treasure is guarded by the dragon at the in the garden of the Hesperides and the golden apples. And Jason goes, to get the golden fleece. It's all about going out there, getting something, acquiring something which has magical or beautiful or heroic properties, and bringing it back so that your life can be transformed, or the kingdom of your people can be transformed for the better. You go out on the quest and you acquire the treasure. It's all about treasure seeking, right? Now think about this legendarium. The entire story is a quest of letting go. It's a quest of not consuming. It's a question of realizing that something that somebody else has offered you is false, and that you just don't need it and that you should let it go. So first of all, just talking culturally for a minute, if ever there was a culture that needed a magnificent epic of letting go rather than acquisition, it is ours. We are consuming ourselves and our world to death. We have a modern mythos, which is entirely that getting stuff will make you happy. I purchase, therefore I am. The ring of the till affirms my identity and meaning and purpose because I bought that beautiful thing. And that's what's killing us, is what's killing the world. So the idea that there should be an epic story in which you've got something but you let it go, because if we're going to survive at all, we're going to have to let a whole bunch of stuff go and radically alter the way we live. That's, it's just going to have to be done, and it's going to have to be done in the next 20 or 30 years, or there's going to be no chance to do it at all. So suddenly to have this story of letting go is astonishing. But of course, for us as Christians, this epic of emptying, this bringing a blessing and a salvation to the whole of a people by relinquishing power, is itself one of the most beautiful re-expressions of the gospel. Though he was found in form equal to God, he did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and became obedient even unto death. Therefore God hath highly exalted him and given him the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. That the greatest story of all is precisely the story of God's willingness to let go even of equality with God, in order utterly to walk with us and be with us. And we see that all over the legendarium, particularly in Strider, as it were, being this raggedy ranger of the north. But we see it ultimately in Bilbo letting go of the ring to Frodo, and in Frodo agreeing to the quest to take the ring to Mount Doom. And although there's nothing studied, and I don't think there's any point at which Tolkien sits down and says, now let me find a nice handy legendarium equivalent of the Philippians passage on kenosis. I know, I'll make a story about a ring. He's not doing that at all. But because the gospel is just bred into him, it's in his bones, it's in every part of him, he has been all his life taking part in the Eucharistic enactment of all of this. He has been the wafer. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the way bread of the elves is the wafer of the Blessed Sacrament, and that it's holy. And that's why Gollum reacts against it, but why Frodo says, I do believe it would do you good. It is ultimately the viaticum, that we receive at the end. I mean, viaticum, as you know in Latin, via tecum. So via is with you. It's to take with you on the way. Via is way, tecum is with you. So viaticum literally means with you on the way. Waybread, it is the thing you take with you through that journey. So, there is that. And I've given you just at the very end here, the great passage is from where he gives us this beautiful word, eucatastrophe. He says, we're all living in this catastrophe. But there is a eucatastrophe. There is a good catastrophe. That is to say, a catastrophe is an unexpected, massive, all-changing event that appears to come out of nowhere and screws you. Yeah, so a eucatastrophe is a massive, all-changing event that appears to come out of nowhere and saves you. And is the thing you could never have dared to hope for, and yet as soon as it happens, you realise you've been hoping for it all along. And, obviously, there are many small eucatastrophes, and there is a great eucatastrophe in the plot of The Lord of the Rings. And then, so let's just conclude with these extracts just to remind you of them. So the gospel, this is from On Fairy Stories. The gospel contains a fairy story. If you stop reading there, you'd say, oh, that's very unsound, that Tolkien. He's just told me, oh, that's dreadful. But luckily you don't stop reading there. The gospel contains a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels. This is the gospels. Peculiarly artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But, this is what he said to Lewis on that walk, in Addison's Walk. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and the aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of human history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The story begins and ends in joy. And then this wonderful thing. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many sceptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it, this is the gospel, the evangelium, for the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or wrath. It's not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history. It looks forward or backward, the direction of this regard is to the great eucatastrophe. And of course, the gospel is this story, which does turn out to be true. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. It's going to happen because that's why you dreamed it, because it's always going to come true. Stories shall go on and on. The evangelium has not abrogated legends. It has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The gospel has not brought an end to legends. It has hallowed them. The Christian has still to work with mind and body to suffer, hope and die, but we may now perceive that all our bents and faculties have a purpose which can be redeemed. I mean, it's magnificent stuff. The life and the art coming together. And it works, and it's true, and the evangelium is true, the legendarium is true, because ultimately of that participatory imagination that Coleridge put his finger on, that there is something going on in the finite mind as we make fully with the imagination, which echoes the eternal act of creation. Okay, sorry, over.